we're going to have today, which is why the meeting is scheduled to run an additional couple of hours from what we're used to, which is an update on the business plan workshop that WETA has been leading for the last well over a year. And directors Moyer and Alba have been working very closely with the staff to generate a vision that we can then meet for the next 30 years. So it's really, really important work to help guide us into the future. So today we're going to discuss the plan, including planning, policies, funding, and strategies to carry out what we call the 2050 WETA service vision. So I'm going to turn it over to staff. I think Seamus, you might want to introduce it, and Kevin Connolly is going to make the presentation, I believe.
Sure. Thank you. Kevin Connolly, Manager of Planning and Development here at WETA. Melanie, if I can get the show on the screen.
Can you tell me how you're going?
Oh, she's trying to help Jeff.
Oh, yes.
Responder one. While this is booting up, I will say that I'll be the first of several speakers, and we're going to go through some material that's primarily focusing on two areas: service planning and what a vision is, as well as the financial capacity analysis that we've done through the summer. We've had a very active summer working with our stakeholders, and we've used and utilized the input that we had from our stakeholders to craft this workshop that we're going to have with you today. It's meant to be iterative, meant to have discussion. Please feel free to jump in, ask questions, make the discussion. At the same time, Seamus will be our police officer because we only have 2 hours to get through quite a lot of material. And we're not trying to, we want to make sure you get your money's worth. You as a board, as well as many of our stakeholders that are involved here on the screen and in person here.
So if I may ask Kevin, how do you want, we can certainly engage in an iterative discussion. I think it's a little hard for the members of the public to just jump in unless, if you'd like, we could have folks raise their hand and do that. So do you want to hold the public until after the presentation, or would you like me to call on members of the public who may have a question during it?
So thank you for that question. I would suggest that the latter, which is that at the end, allow the public to weigh in, because it's a totality.
Yeah.
I think you as a board, and I'll also say that many of the members of the public, particularly the stakeholders that have been involved through the summer, have seen much of this material. So you as board members, aside from our board subcommittee, you're seeing it for the first time. So you should ask questions, and at the end of it, it's a great idea to allow the public to weigh in at that point.
So we'll try to restrict as much as possible for them to be clarifying questions so that we don't end up going into a discussion that's long and then interrupting the rest of the presentation. So I want to make sure you get through it, so then we can have the totality of it, as you said. So it's a good idea.
Thank you. Thank you. And starting off well, because Tom is here to help with this. And I can just walk us through the background. I don't need slides to do this. But I'll say that our agenda today is to inform you, have discussion, and then move on to what we're going to do next. And a lot of what we're doing today is relating to you our discussions with our stakeholder groups. We had a business advisory stakeholder group, a community advisory stakeholder group, and all of the government agencies that were organized on the county level. And they helped us contribute to a potential vision options in terms of what we're doing. Those visions are not meant to be a specific. We're not choosing one as a team. We're not asking you to choose one as a board. We want to have a bunch of visions and test them in terms of a number of futures. And I think a theme that we heard from all of our outreach is nobody really knows what's going to happen into the future. And therefore, it's really hard to have a vision for how WETA responds. But what we can do is look at different futures, look at different future WETAs, and say, how do we measure up, and how is this going to work? And this will be clarified as we get into the into the details of the presentation. So our goals are, again, to update, share, inform. But just a little bit of background. We have a project team in addition to staff, Mike Gowrie and Gabe Chen, our primary planners working on this. We have a really good consultant team, Fair and Peers, and Civic Makers. You'll be hearing from Civic Makers later when we talk about outreach. And then we have the board subcommittee. And the board subcommittee has met at strategic points along the way. They've provided guidance and helpful with feedback. And so this is a group effort. There's several pieces of work that haven't taken place yet. Emergency response, environmental stewardship. Those are coming in the fall, in the spring. So this is just what we've done so far. As I mentioned, we've had a very busy summer with workshop, pre-planning, stakeholder groups, a lot of active participation in a high level of enthusiasm, which we very much appreciated. And in the spring, that led us to really identify these 6 focus areas. You as the board were involved in this discussion. And these are the 6 areas. Again, today we're going to focus on the regional ferry network and the financial capacity. And then we'll see environmental, emergency response, organization, community connections at our next workshop. This is a whole effort that our target is next summer to complete. So while we had a very active and busy summer, we expect the fall and spring to be just as active and busy, particularly in the areas of analysis. So what we've been doing is framing things up until now, and now we're to the point where we're really going to start doing a lot of study and analysis. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
Feels like my first day of school. I'm back in person for the first time. A little weird. Thanks, Kevin, for queuing everything up here. So this next part of the presentation is going to be a summary of the outreach that we've done over the last few months over the summer that Kevin mentioned. So we wanted to start with an abbreviated version of what we told, what we presented to these groups, so you can kind of get a flavor of what their feedback is based on. So it was a 45-minute presentation that we gave. I'm going to try and cover it in about 5 minutes and just give you a few highlights. So one of the things we put to the advisory groups as well as the county working groups was why provide ferry service? What are the motivations? What are the purposes WETA should seek to achieve in providing the services it does? And we walked through a few options here and asked them to prioritize what's important to them, not necessarily choosing one, but identifying a combination of factors that they think we should prioritize in terms of pursuing a service vision. And just one here to note, support economic development. This is a particularly interesting one because it's never been explicitly acknowledged as a goal of the WTA or even the WETA, but we see a lot of systems nationally and internationally that are really designed around this notion. And, we've heard from our partners over the last few years that this is a priority for them. So we wanted to list it here and see what our stakeholders told. We also wanted to provide some context, kind of a ferry service planning 101. And so we identified some factors that we prioritize in, or we feel create ultimately at the end of the day, a competitive ferry service. And these include, elements of appeal, such as frequency of service hours, elements of competitiveness with other modes, such as travel time and fares. And then this kind of intangible factor that's really unique to ferries, which is ride quality. And so this represents the notion that there are amenities and opportunities on board a ferry that you just don't get with bus or rail or even driving. These are the views on the bay, the available seats on board the vessels, and the beer and the food that we serve for people going back for happy hour after work. That said, it's not necessarily feasible. Well, it's certainly not feasible to build a ferry service anywhere along the shoreline of San Francisco. And so we thought it was important to identify what we view as some fundamental constraints of where ferry service can be built. And I'll just highlight 2 of them here. Terminal access. You have to ultimately get people to the ferry terminal. And so that's either locating ferry terminals near the activity centers that we want to serve, or providing the first last mile connections to get to create that linkage between the activity centers and terminals. And then just the other one to highlight here, environmental sensitivity. Obviously, our system is dedicated to being a good steward of the environment. So there are certain areas of the shoreline and San Francisco Bay that have sensitive species or habitat that just really aren't practical or feasible to build at. This is an example of a question that we put to the groups. What kinds of markets could WETA serve? And so these are 4 options we gave. Again, it wasn't picking the one. They were able to pick a combination and tell us like what their priorities are. So some examples here are, should WETA focus on markets that have other transit options, that have driving options, or should we really go into markets that have neither? Another interesting option here are local markets. And similar to the economic development purpose of ferries, this one's interesting because it hasn't necessarily been something WETA has explicitly focused on in the past, but we've heard a lot of interest from it, from our stakeholders, from our partners over the years. And so we wanted to put it out there as an option that we can think about for a future service vision for the agency. And this would be short haul services that really create local connections along shoreline activity centers, 2 to 3 miles, where connections don't exist today. So with that context, and there were some other things we went over as well, such as when should WETA provide service, and should the focus be on ridership or geographic coverage? With that context, I'm going to turn it over to civic makers to kind of report out on what we heard from not only the 2 advisory groups listed here, but also the public at large through a survey instrument we offered on the project website, as well as the county and city groups that we convened over the last summer. So I believe this will be Lawrence Grodeska from Civic Makers. All right, take it away, Lawrence.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you all. Great to see you again. My name is Lawrence Grodeska. I'm from Civic Makers, and we've been supporting this project since last fall with the initial stakeholder convening as part of the deepening into the service visioning and business planning effort that Mike spoke about. We'll talk about our public outreach efforts to date. Myself and my colleague, Mike King. I'll focus on the advisory groups we hosted. We hosted 2 advisory groups in June and I think early July. And those were a business advisory group and a broader advisory group for a range of community voices. Here are the organizations that were represented, and I'll talk a little bit more about the characterization of those 2 groups in a moment. The groups really were very engaged and very excited to learn and contribute to the future of water transportation and emergency response. And we're honored to be a part of this. And really, we're setting up these advisory groups to be a through line for continual feedback as you all provide guidance and direction. The first agenda was similar to what you saw Mike present in abbreviated fashion, really an update on progress to date and a high-level overview to an introduction to Ferry network planning, which I found fascinating. I know the participants found fascinating to understand what goes into staff's efforts to make sure that the services are competitive and meeting needs. And then the bulk of the meeting was devoted to a discussion about next network expansion options and constraints, and also a discussion of considerations around potential future scenarios. I should also note that the groups that participated were, there's a lot of overlap with the first stakeholder convening in last fall. And so felt like there's really great continuity and a good sort of set of continual engagement with both key stakeholders and voices you've heard from, but also a broader set of folks that are newer to the process. Next slide, please. So the first group was the business advisory group. We do have a picture of them on the next slide, so you get to see some faces in a moment here. That meeting was on June 16th. There's 18 folks that attended, and that was a combination of local chambers of commerce and regional chambers of commerce and economic development alliances, large businesses, as well as employers from across the Bay Area. As far as the feedback primarily that we heard from them, and there's some overlap between the 2 advisory groups, which I'll get to, and it's good to see. There was a general sense that they felt prioritizing ridership over coverage was the way to go. because of just the desire to move as many people as possible. And really a strong preference for a focus on all-day service versus peak-only service to sort of meet the emerging and evolving needs of commuter transportation, and also just non-business trips as well across the region. Prioritize markets with existing and seamless last mile connections. So really focus on those areas that have strong connections to ferry terminals and make sure that that last mile, that critical first and last mile, is part of your planning efforts. And there wasn't much of a preference from this group for complementary versus overlapping markets. As far as the futures and considerations that they felt should be part of this process, certainly the importance of procuring local and regional transit funding to continue to be able to offer a high level of robust services. Thinking about the changes to commute patterns over the next few decades with the changes in work from home and whatnot. And then also it came up later in this group, just the importance of earthquake resilience and emergency response to this group. We have the next slide, and you'll see some of the folks here that participated. Again, really highly engaged group and a lot of great conversation and feedback. Let's go into the community advisor group and the next slide. So this meeting was July 13th, and we had 22 folks from across community-based organizations from across the region, transit and environmental advocates, and then also interested community members from across the Bay Area. As far as the network expansion conversation, similarly, this group of folks also felt that prioritizing ridership over coverage was the way to go for WETA. Focusing on all-day service versus peak-only service was another overlap and similarity between the groups. They were really advocating for ferry service in their respective markets. So I think it makes sense that the folks that are a bit more local as far as their work and efforts were speaking a bit more kind of provincially. And then there was a slight general preference towards overlapping markets as far as a consideration versus complementary versus overlapping. And as far as the uncertainty of potential futures, again, importance of procuring funding, the environment came up with this group, not surprisingly, and everything from electrification of the fleet to being sensitive to environmental habitat, and also the importance of thinking about land use policy and development around different transit centers as as what it thinks about sort of what the network will look like in the coming decades. And next slide, you'll see a picture of this group. We feel really good about the representation that we had both from the business and the community advisor groups. And as Kevin said, this was all compiled into a report, which I think you've received, which has been incorporated into Fair and Pierce work, et cetera. We also did a lot of other public outreach through a microsite, and I'm going to turn it over to, and a surveys poll, a priority surveys poll, I'm going to turn it over to Mike King to talk about.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. Great to be here. Great to see the WETA board members again, and thank you for having me. As Lawrence mentioned, we launched a project microsite back in mid-May. So it's the Bay Ferry 2050 website. You can see a screenshot of the homepage there, and hopefully folks participating in this meeting have had a chance to take a look at it. If you haven't, encourage you to do so. The site includes a video narrated by Executive Director Seamus Murphy describing the planning effort. It came out really well. It's fantastic. Please take a look at that. It includes an overview of the project, the timeline that Kevin shared earlier, as well as the 6 focus areas that have been highlighted as part of this meeting. And then, most importantly, the website provides opportunities for the public to share their vision, their opinions, and their ideas, and to sign up for project updates, so that as we continue to move forward in this planning process and go through all the different opportunities for input and decision-making moments, the public has a chance to weigh in on what their preferences are for water transit and emergency response in the future. And so we began formally promoting the website in mid-July, using a variety of channels, including WETA passenger newsletter stories, social media posts, onboard graphics on ferries, and really reaching out to our partners and stakeholders, including elected officials and nonprofit organizations, to encourage them to get the word out to their networks. And they did an incredible job. All these channels led to a response of over 2,200 visitors to the site since it was launched in mid-May, with 58 folks signing up, 3% signing up for periodic project updates. Most of those folks came to the site directly through the website URL, while around 9% found the site through social media and other channels. So really fantastic engagement so far, and a great response. Folks are definitely getting to the site, learning about the project, and that will continue going forward. Next slide. In terms of our first online digital engagement opportunity, we launched a quick 7-question priorities poll back in mid-July. And at the same time that we started promoting the website, we promoted this poll to the broader public to get as much response as possible. And we've also seen just an incredible response to this opportunity as well. So 1,048 completed submissions in just over a month's time. So really incredible. This poll is going to continue to be open for another 2 weeks. And so we expect the numbers to continue to grow. But for such a short engagement period, really have seen a great response from the public. And I'll give you a snapshot of some of the questions that we asked, and we tried to make sure that the questions were aligned with the conversations that we were having with the advisory groups. And so very similar questions about barriers to using ferry service, how to prioritize ferry expansion, and when ferry service should be offered. This first question, how often do you use the ferry? We see that 41% of respondents use the ferry a few times per year. Another 20% use the ferry a few times per month. 19% use the ferry a few times per week, and 8% use the ferry every day. And so what we're seeing is that the poll responses were relatively split between people who are practiced at using the San Francisco Bay Ferry and those who use it rarely or not at all, which is great in terms of getting a broad sense of public preferences. It's really quite a mix, which is what we want to see from a quick priorities poll like this. Next question, sorry, if you could go back. Yeah, thank you. So the next question was, what are the primary barriers that prevent you from using the ferry more often? To which respondents said, most respondents cited either schedule or coverage issues. So essentially the ferry doesn't run when they need it to, or it doesn't go where they need it to. So really helpful to see that perspective. The next question that we'll highlight is, we asked folks, how should we prioritize expanding ferry service? To which respondents generally preferred prioritizing strong ridership routes and greater network coverage. Certainly that idea of maximizing ridership is, we saw with the advisory groups, a shared preference there. But I think noteworthy for this question as well is that folks were also interested in routes that are cost effective to operate and that can serve disadvantaged communities. Next slide. When we asked as part of the poll, what kinds of trips should ferries serve? We saw that respondents overwhelmingly preferred commute service to other types of trips. Not necessarily that those other trips aren't important, but as you can see in the rankings, significantly more folks prioritized work commutes when filling out this poll. And then next slide. So the final question that we wanted to highlight from this priorities poll is asking the public, when should we prioritize providing service? To which we learned that respondents largely preferred peak period service, which certainly aligns with their answer in the previous question to prioritize commute service. So definitely want to make sure that those commute hours are well covered. I think again, these responses are a great companion to the outreach that we did with the advisory groups. And I'm going to hand it over in a second back to WETA staff to talk about convening the county working groups. And we'll see, I think, continued alignment in terms of the feedback that was received. So at this point, I'll hand it over to, I believe, Gabe Chan to talk about the county working groups.
All right, thanks, Mike. Good morning, Board of Directors. Gabriel Chan, Transportation Planner at WETA. So in addition to the community and business advisory groups, we also convened 5 different county level working groups that are comprised of either city staff in different municipalities or county level government agencies. So we had a group for Alameda, Solano, San Francisco, San Mateo, and Contra Costa counties. And some common themes that we pulled out of these 5 different working groups. The first is to match service to demand and being fiscally responsible with that. So investing in kind of our highest ridership routes and providing high quality service on those routes. But at the same time, also balancing that with serving new markets that might have moderate or low demand currently, but maybe using kind of different approaches to serve that moderate or lower demand. So looking at maybe smaller vessels or private operators that would be more suited to a smaller market than, say, putting a 400-person ferry down the Carquinez Strait, something like that. Another kind of point that we drew from these county level working groups was the need to fill regional gaps and also make sure that our emergency response resiliency was still strong. So something we heard was, especially across the San Mateo and Carquinez bridges, there isn't really a connection that can, in the event of an emergency, be used to cross those straits, right? So we have really strong and robust emergency response potential with the Bay Bridge corridor, but with some of the other bridges in the Bay Area region, we don't necessarily have that currently. And then the third theme that we kind of pulled out of these county level working groups was the need to focus on equity moving forward in the next few decades, and not just kind of in one aspect of our ferry service, right? We need to look at it from fares, schedules, and also our first and last mile connections. And so historically, right, the ferry system has been kind of a white collar commuter focused system. And moving forward, there was a strong desire to kind of shift that focus, try to incorporate more riders who are transit dependent or might be blue collar workers and open up more job access for people, maybe from the East Bay to the peninsula or to other parts of the region. And so with that, there was a desire to keep fares low and continue the pandemic fare recovery program. We heard that overwhelmingly was very popular, of course. And then also having schedules reflect kind of the needs of people who are not just the white collar workers, focus on more all day service, consistent with kind of the other community and business working groups. And then the first last mile connection piece is also something that was really important, especially for San Mateo County, where they have some large employers that aren't necessarily at the shoreline. And for some counties, there's a hesitancy to develop too much at the shoreline. And so having those robust first last mile connections to get to points of interest further inland was really important. So a few other points of feedback that we heard from these county partners. The first is there's a desire to kind of use the ferry as an economic development tool, especially kind of in Solano, Contra Costa, Alameda counties, kind of these communities that historically have not had regional transit service. The second is, and we heard this from our partners in San Francisco, that the pre-pandemic assumptions is kind of how they're moving forward in their long-range planning efforts. Kind of a regression to the 2019 baseline is their kind of best projection of how to move forward. The third is the threat of sea level rise, right? We talked about this a little bit in all of the working groups about how sea level rise is really a challenge at the shoreline, and we need to make sure that our ferry system is resilient and can withstand sea level rise moving forward. And then there was also recognition that even though we might want to shift our focus less away or away from kind of the white collar commuter, there will still be some markets that are primarily white collar commuter markets, and we have to recognize that as well. And then finally, we heard a strong desire to get ferry service out to new markets despite kind of lower demand. And so I think as long as we're weighing the lower demand markets with still prioritizing those high ridership routes, that's kind of what we heard across the board, right? We need to take a balanced approach. And then a quick recap of kind of everything that we've done so far with our outreach. Right, we have the blended approach, looking at high ridership routes, but also covering some new markets, prioritizing access, especially that terminal access and first last mile connection, a stronger focus on all day service, and then also looking at how can we provide service to lower demand markets, and then also looking at making sure we're covering all of the bridge corridors in the Bay Area that might not have ferry service currently. And then all of those definitely get wrapped up with the online survey. We saw that the public is pretty much in line with kind of all of our working groups and advisory groups. And so in general, I think we have a pretty clear message after all the outreach of how we're going to move forward with our service planning effort. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mike.
Great, and we're gonna pause to maybe have a bit of a discussion here, take any comments. But before doing that, I just want to acknowledge that we have a lot of the people that participated in the meetings online today. And so I want to thank them for showing up and thank them for their participation as well. And then just reiterate, the whole package of what we went through is it's incredibly important because it's going to serve as the foundation for what we're going to present in the latter half of the workshop today. So if there's any questions about what we heard, who we reached out to, who we perhaps didn't reach out to, I'm happy to field those questions right now.
Yeah, I have
Dr.
a question. I understand, of course, the desire to reduce the fares as much as possible, but looking and right now, because of the federal money we've received and continue to receive, we're not as worried as maybe we used to be about fare box return. But any discussion about how we'll come up with the money to do all this?
Yeah, there was discussion to the extent that it was acknowledged that considerably large and new sources of money will be required to probably step beyond what we have in our strategic plan today, even to execute what we have in our strategic plan. And we're actually going to have a module of this workshop that's kind of dedicated to our financial situation that really shows to continue the fares we have today, to even continue what we're doing, it will require new money. And that magnitude of new money increases the more that we propose to do beyond what we have in our strategic plan today.
Right. I don't want to give the impression I'm against expansion and all of that. It's my concern is that we build expectations, and if we haven't identified even some method of financing it, what are we doing?
Yeah, I would just comment, Tony, to that, is that, there is, I guess there has been for a number of years, and there is an ongoing consideration of a future regional measure for transportation. And, hanging in the balance is Regional Measure 3 in the, California Supreme Court, where we'll talk about that later, but there should be a decision which should tell us something about where our finances are likely to be outside of fare box, in the next couple of months. And then, there's, and the way that's perceived by others who are going to draft the measure. But, there's a bit of a chicken and egg here when it comes to the regional measure, because some people who are involved in that may feel like, well, the ferry system is whole. And, what I think Mike is saying is that even under the best consideration, we're going to need additional funding to achieve even the vision that's in the strategic plan. So in terms of the chicken and the egg, I think it's kind of important for us. And if you look at this process, this is a very comprehensive process. You've reached out to a lot of people. You've been very inclusive. It's time consuming. I think because we're looking at 2050, that's kind of a good thing. For a process like this, it's okay to take time because we don't have to build the bridge by tomorrow. Took us 20-something years to get the Bay Bridge redone, but that was different than this. So here I think it's appropriate to take time and get it right and be inclusive and so forth. But having a vision for where we want to go with all of this, and you've laid out a lot of the, what people see as the different opportunities is really important as we enter that regional measure discussion in serious, because it's going to, we're going to need the legislature. The state legislature is probably going to need to be the ones who say this agency gets this much or these projects and all of that. And we're being heavy competition with others. So, I think this, it's really important for us to be able to say to the Bay Area, here's our vision, here's what we think we should do, why we think we should do it, because how we fare in that regional measure, assuming there is one, is going to be really important. And that's going to happen in the next few years.
I would think that we would need a regional measure 4. Hopefully regional measure 3 will survive. And if it does, it'll do a lot to keep us going for a certain amount of time. But given the vision that we have, there's going to be a need for regional measure 4.
Right. And folks might think that we don't need it because if we get regional measure 3 done, WETA did really well in that, in that piece of
the problem with that one
Yeah.
is that the money is static. You get 35 million a year, but then it doesn't grow. And if our vision is we're going to grow, then we got to have a measure 4, and we got to know whether we need to have a 2/3 vote or a majority vote. And
Same
who's
thing.
going to lead that effort?
Yeah, and I'll just note, I think an important precedent to think of is the last round of strategic planning that WETA did. That actually preceded Regional Measure 3 and the legislation that ultimately created that. We were able to, through a similar but perhaps more limited process, even develop a vision, that was vetted with stakeholders, adopted by the WETA board in advance of Regional Measure 3 even being talked about. And so when they went around the region and started asking for projects and ideas, we had something baked. And that plan largely is what was funded through RM3. And so we see a potential opportunity to do something similar here with a to be determined future regional measure.
Right.
If we get to the vision that the board agrees with here, that can kind of become the foundation for our advocacy work to get that new funding to present the vision that somebody can, invest in.
Jeff, that's a question.
Director Alba, and I see
Okay.
Director Delbano's got his hand up too. Good. Director Alba, did you have a
Okay,
comment?
yeah, I want to say it's fantastic to see both the consistency across the different stakeholder groups. We have riders, we have non-riders or riders who just use the system a few times a year, provide fairly consistent responses in addition to the counties and the business group and the advocacy groups. And it's fantastic to see that there's a strong interest in seeing WETA and San Francisco Bay Ferry grow, that we have the support. I think that just shows that we're moving in the right direction and that the right work is being done here. The foundation is being laid for what is coming. One thing that is striking to me is that we did really well with our pandemic recovery program in that where our ridership in June is up to 80% of pre-pandemic levels. Whereas the other regional bigger systems are still at 25 to 35, 40%. And I'm wondering, the fare elasticity and the program changes that we made had a significant impact on the number of riders we see today on the system. And I think we need to take that into account as we're moving forward, that yes, we're losing revenue, operating revenue by reducing our fares. And yes, we're talking about expanding our service, both in regards to existing markets and potentially new markets. But the numbers support that. We're moving in, we're creating a more equitable system. And I think the entire region is showing us that, or showing their support for what we're doing. So I think it's fantastic to have all of this background and stakeholder information as we're moving into the next service vision development.
Certainly says, whatever you did, do more of that.
Yes,
It seems.
exactly.
Yeah. Director Del Bono?
Can you guys hear me now?
Mhm.
That's good. Sorry I couldn't be there. One of the things that I want to bring up, and Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but Regional Measure 3, one of the huge things that we got through was the fact that there is no requirement for box fare recovery anymore on the ferries if it goes through in its entirety. Am I wrong about that? Like, we put language in there that wouldn't require box fare recovery for it.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't recall the answer.
Yeah.
You're saying fare box recovery?
Yeah, fare box recovery. We put language in there and it had passed. And that was one of the big things about Regional Measure 3 to me, was the fact that we wouldn't be required to have, we have to still work with obviously with other agencies and stuff, but it doesn't require us to have a box fare recovery on the routes. That was part of that language, unless it got taken out or changed. But and it's been so long since we looked at it, but I think that is in there, that we are not going to be required to have that on our routes.
I think you're correct for the Regional Measure 3 funds.
Yeah.
It won't apply to Regional Measure 2 and Regional Measure 1. Is that correct, Kevin?
Regional Measure 2 would not change. Regional Measure 3, the way it works is that we would have a 5-year plan every 5 years that we develop in concert with MTC. And we have yet to determine, because everything's been held up, we haven't worked it out with MTC. I think informally in discussions with MTC staff, they recognize that we probably should have some sort of metric. They also recognize that the current one is flawed in many ways. So I guess the truthful answer to the question put out there is it's to be determined.
So maybe it's a good question for council to look at. You don't have to answer it now, but we at the Bay Area Council were heavily involved in working this bill through the legislature. And I know Emily Loper's loping somewhere back there. She might be able to answer it. But one of the things I know we did was we took more control at WETA than we had before on the previous regional measures. So before, we had to kind of go to the bank of MTC for approval for stuff. Yeah. And they were very wedded to the 40% fare box recovery. Yeah. And I do think we got some relief from that and some more control out of it, which we think was in order. So, but maybe we could get a report on that at a future meeting, just so we, because it's been a while. Of course, Regional Measure 3, we're going to have to really look at it a lot, assuming it comes to pass. And if the court decides against us, then we don't really need to look into it too much, because we'll be starting from scratch.
And just to finish up my comment, and I'll be done. But with that, and that is exactly what Kevin said, is what I remember, is we had to work with MTC. But I think Seamus and staff and all of us should really consider on, when we go into negotiations or talks with MTC, that we should probably talk about it beforehand, because I don't want to see our hands tied, because that was a huge part of getting that legislation through with that language in there, that it didn't tie us to a 40% box fare recovery. So I put that on the radar for everybody. Thank you.
The thing that concerns me is that I understand that MTC had this requirement. They may go back to it, they may not, or maybe reduce it, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to figure out the money, because where is the money going to come from if it doesn't come from the fare box? And it won't come from the fare box if we It can't. We're reducing fares in any event, and we're trying to make it more equitable. So where does the money come from? And I think we've talked about it. It's a new measure 4, because measure 3 will not do it, even if we survive that court challenge.
Well, we still have, I think you're obviously correct
Yeah.
in your thinking about the math. Now, we still do charge a fare. And we have there's going to be some regional work on fare restructuring and thinking about it. So, eventually it would be good if we're more in line regionally. And, my view is a trip on the ferry should be more in line with a trip on BART, which I think is too expensive. So I think what we're trying to do is make public transit more attractive. I think WETA's done that by adjusting its fares.
I don't question
And
that.
when you get more passengers, it's not like we reduced it to 0 so that you say, well, how do we increase revenue? We just have a multiplier of 0. It's not that. We do have fares. People do pay them. And in fact, in the report today, we hit our fare target because of what Director Alba said, is we've seen a pretty big uptick lately, which is a really good trend. But look, Director Untitled, your point as well taken. We need to know where the funds are coming from. And we're making a plan here, which on the one hand is visionary, and on the other hand is constrained. And we have to figure out the balance. And Director Alba.
I'm not
and
trying to be
Director Moyer
negative.
want-
I'm not trying to be negative.
Did you have you have the floor, did you have other comments or
No,
questions?
that's it.
Yeah,
That's it.
because I think you made a good, you're making a good point.
The only thing I want to say is that, to me, a 2050 service vision is a vision. And we're accompanying it with a business plan. And this will evolve over the coming 30 years, right? Every few years, we're going to scratch our head and say, we cannot do this because we do not have the funds to do it. But if we're not ambitious now and setting ourselves up for the right future, we will not get there. And so by taking the information that we're gathering from stakeholders, from all the agencies that are involved, we're setting ourselves up for potential success using equity and affordability and first and last mile connections. We're integrated transit. We're setting ourselves up for better success than to say, well, we're not going to get enough funding in order to do what we want by 2050, which is 30 years away. So to me, it's so important that maybe 2050 becomes 2060 or 2070, 10 or 20 years from now, but moving in this direction. And then, of course, taking into account changing hybrid work agreements and federal support for new ferry service or state and regional measures. Those are secondary. But if we're not ambitious now, I think we're constraining ourselves.
I don't have any problem with supporting the vision. I think it's wonderful. I'm just saying that we got to figure out the money.
Yes, I agree.
Director Moyer?
Thank you. So I would like to take this opportunity first and foremost to thank all of the community members and all the volunteers and the staff who have worked so tirelessly to bring this process to where it is today. I really am, I have extreme gratitude, and I'm really just impressed with what the work that's been done, but also with the feedback. And for me, the feedback is twofold. One, it generally supports all that we've been doing in what we've been doing with, as we just discussed, with our fare programs, but also with our service enhancements and with our vessels. And as we try to look at faster vessels, more environmentally friendly vessels, these are all really important decisions that we make each and every meeting. And this feedback helps to guide us and to underscore that. I think so thank you all very much, and please continue to do that with or without this vision. I really think it's important to have that community engagement and guidance. with respect to the conversation at hand, I completely, I think you summarized it well, Director Alba, in that we need to have an ambitious plan. That's what a vision is. I think in the comments that have already been presented by the team, there's already here a guidepost for a lot of agility, and the plan will have that agility. And some of that agility may come as Gabriel presented with respect to looking at different ways of providing service with different vessels, so we'll have to make sure that, and I think we have done a good job of this, making sure that our landside investments can be as agile as maybe our vessels and our talent can be. One question, you did ask if we had questions, and I do have one. I'm kind of curious, I didn't see MTC as one of the working group members, maybe I missed that, but or ABAG for that matter, but have we looked yet or incorporated any of the population growth forecasts and looked kind of just topographically where those are going to occur and how they might ultimately influence any expansion plans, or how does that flow into our overall analysis?
Great question.
Thank you.
So that will all be incorporated, that and variations of that. Because I think that's one of the uncertainties that our stakeholders as well as staff have identified. MTC has its population and employment forecasts out there, and we'll definitely base some of the futures that we consider on that. And we'll directly pull that from MTC. But even beyond that, we're going to look at variations. What if more population growth, employment growth happens than regionally forecasted? How would that affect the options that we're carrying forward? What if there's less? How would that affect the options that we carry forward? And so we'll be leaning very heavily on a lot of the regional assumptions that MTC has made into the future. Was that?
Yeah, that was exactly what I was asking about. And I think to that point, if the population growth is happening, I'll just make this up, but if it's happening more east than along the shoreline, then is the ferry service the right service to capture that growth? And how do we, is our focus really going to be more on that last mile or that connectivity, or even as we have an agenda item later, that continued partnership among the other providers so that we have a seamless service across the region. So thank you. Looking forward to the rest of our discussion. It's been good so far.
I would like to first of all, thank you, Director Moyer and Director Alba, for working with the staff team and the consultants on this. I think it's been a delightful discussion. I think this is the best discussion I've witnessed in my 6 years on the board, and I haven't completed it yet. But this is exactly the kind of thing we should be doing, because I think the day-to-day operations of the organization are, pretty well in hand for the most part, and what we're really looking at is kind of charting the future for an organization that was created to chart the future. So we're, that is our mission given to us by the state in the legislation, is to figure out how to make ferry service a viable way of life as much as is possible, reasonable, and functional. And so I like the discussion very, very much. Thanks for helping us frame it. I like that you put economic development in the mix. I think that was always the intention, or should be, and we should be absolutely thinking about as a region what makes the most sense. And economic development is a very broad term, so it can take on many different meanings to different constituencies. But I would apply it, very, very broadly, is how can ferry service enable more people to succeed in living life the way they choose to live it in the Bay Area, and how it can contribute overall to the kind of the greater economy of the Bay Area and the people in the Bay Area, all people in the Bay Area, which gets to the point on equity, which I think is something we didn't talk about as much years ago and probably should have. But I like the fact that we're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it at WETA, and as was stated, we're kind of proving the point a little bit so far, and there's more to prove and accomplish on it. So this really should be unequivocally a service that regular folks in their regular things that they do in life can make can make use of the water transit system. And it isn't just for white collar commuters, although they're important too to the economy. So it's certainly not one, but both. And, I think we have to accommodate that. I like the point on the Carquinez and the San Mateo as two important spans, which if they end up interrupted, we don't have today a service that really accommodates that. We don't have terminals. We don't have the means by which to address that. So, that's interesting. I don't think we've spoken about that, but I think that the fact that that came up in these discussions is really relevant, and it's something we shouldn't ignore by any means. As far as there's always the reality that ferry terminals tend to be on the water as opposed to inland, and so you've got to be able to get to them. And so how do you get to the shoreline? How do you get to these places? So in a futuristic mode that we're in here and looking 10 years out, I would just say that first last mile is going to look very, very different in a decade than it looks today, and a decade after that, between bikes, between different scooters, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, different kinds of shuttles that will come. Aircraft, who knows what, but it's going to look very different than it looks today. So we should be rather open-minded and probably be thinking about this and strategic about this as part of it, and maybe own it. We, so far have really owned up to the shoreline in terms of our development horizon. And in the legislation that we worked on that created WETA, SB 976, we were trying to think in the legislation more broadly, but the legislature didn't want us to, so they restricted it to that. But I think it's time for us to maybe think a little harder about that land side, and I'm sure there are a lot of conversations about it, which gets to the question of shoreline development. So this is an area where WETA has no control over this, but we're a constituent in the thinking about shoreline development. And, I would argue that shoreline development can be a really good thing and should be. It's not something that we should think, well, if there's shoreline development, then we should provide service. I believe we should say there should be shoreline development, and what can we do to make it happen? Because when people live near the shoreline, it means they're living in a cooler environment. They're not demanding as much energy. Their quality of life is improved. Their access to the community benefits is improved. So it's not for the purpose of just getting people on a ferry, but all in all, it's a way of life that's a positive way of life, as shown in many, many communities around the world in which the major ferry systems are part. And in the Bay Area, there's been a reluctance on shoreline development, something we need to protect the shoreline. We need to be aware of sea level rise, all of those things. And I think, obviously there are places and times where we need to do it, but, we see wonderful examples of shoreline development that's taken place here in the last generation, as well as in previous generations, and then in other places. And I think we should be bullish on it when it comes to sea level rise. There is private one way of addressing sea level rise is by investing in it. And one way of investing in it is by drawing private capital to it. If we completely rely on government sources to protect the shoreline, or if our strategy is just going to be to retreat, don't think that that's in every case going to be the best answer. So sometimes, it may be that by engaging in thoughtful shoreline development, we produce the one thing we need to produce in the Bay Area, even more than ferry service, which is housing for people, which is completely constrained. And there are shoreline opportunities to do it. And if we seek them out. So, I think that's a really important question that came up in here, that we should be working with BCDC and legislators and mayors and talking to constituents about how do we understand better the economic benefits of shoreline development, the physical benefits, the environmental benefits, as opposed to seeing it as something, we don't want, we're fearful of, somehow it debilitates the quality of life in the Bay Area. Because I think if we ignore the shoreline, it's not just going to restrict WETA's growth. That's not the ultimate object. It's going to restrict the Bay Area's potential and potential for people who live here to stay here. There's just too many people leaving. We've seen it, to the question about future, where people are going to live in the future. It's not here. People are leaving here. The population has actually declined, and it's going to continue to decline if people can't afford to live here. So we can't solve that whole problem, but there's got to be some movement toward getting people, to want to stay here in ways that they can afford to live. I think somehow we can be part of that. I think we should be part of that. So those are my initial comments. I guess finally I say I'll call on a member of the public, just one member of the public to speak, but he's not here because he passed away, Ron Cowan. And Ron Cowan was the person who envisioned this, created, he was the person behind the legislation who created WTA and WETA. And I spent a lot of time with Ron and promised him after he passed away, I would represent his thinking, which I was pretty familiar with. So, Ron believed in this vision of having a very, very comprehensive, far-reaching strategy that would provide transit for people, all people, and for emergency response and recovery. And so, I think this 2050 project, when we're trying to ask ourselves the question, when I see the question, which is kind of the core question, should we focus on today's service and augmenting that service? Ron's answer would be yes. When we ask the question, should we be expanding to other parts of the market that may not be served yet or may not show as much demand? The answer would be yes. And, to Tony and Tintley's point about how we fund that, Ron would say, figure it out. If we build it, they will come. And so far, Ron's been right. So with that, I don't have any questions. And you want to continue with the presentation and then call on the public, or should we call on the public now?
Yeah, we'll continue. And this really begins.
Sorry for the soliloquy, but I know it's what I've been waiting to have that statement for a while.
We really appreciate the discussion, the feedback. It's very, very helpful. So this is getting into the meatier part of the workshop. Again, everything we've described to date, the early stakeholder work, the current stakeholder work we did over the summer, was really building a foundation for the options we're going to bring forward. And what we're hoping to get from you, the WETA board, is buy-in on these options being the ones that we study over the course of the next few months, and ultimately evaluate and analyze and report back to you on. And if there's anything you have concern about, or you want to see maybe a different look at, we really invite that feedback at this time. Okay, we're gonna kind of present three network expansion concepts. So these can all be thought of as alternate visions for what that 2050 service vision should be. And so one kind of important note, we're calling these 2050 network expansion concepts. That doesn't mean that they're built in 2050. It means they come online by 2050. We haven't looked in any kind of granular way yet at what comes online when, but that would be part of ultimately the evaluation and analysis that we do. So in general, our starting point is the current network here on the left, and we're going to show three options. A baseline option, which includes the enhancement services and expansion services that are in the planned Bay Area 2050. A moderate growth scenario that takes an incremental step above that set of projects and steps out to say, hey, what would we look like? What would it mean for WETA if we did a bit more than planned Bay Area, which is the current strategic plan on the books for WETA? And then a high growth scenario, what would it look like for WETA? We did considerably more than what we're assuming our enhancement and expansion plans are as of today. So in addition to graphically or visually showing what each of these expansion network concepts would look like, we also have a sense of how many terminals and routes these would include. So this is a visualization of our current network, which includes 10 terminals and 6 routes, moving from what we do today to what is currently WETA's expansion plans on the books, 2016 strategic plan, Plan Bay Area. We go from those 10 terminals and 6 routes to 13 terminals and 12 routes. So Plan Bay Area includes the enhancement of the existing services, as well as new services built in Berkeley, Treasure Island, Mission Bay, and Redwood City. So 4 expansion routes. And so, this is the opportunity that we really took to take what we heard from our stakeholders and design these next 2 alternatives that we want to take a look at. So let's begin with the moderate growth. So again, this is an incremental step forward from what's in Plan Bay Area. And so this would be a vision in 2050 that ultimately included 18 terminals and 17 routes. So just to highlight a few of the additions here from the Plan Bay Area baseline, you have a terminal in Hercules, connecting to a terminal in Martinez. So that would be theoretically like a local based service to be determined what kind of vessel that would operate on that. That would be something that we define as part of the evaluation and analysis work that would occur over the next few months. And then we have primarily services beyond Plan Bay Area that we have a high degree that there would be ridership, significant ridership potential on, but that also offer, as Ron would want it, a little bit of both. So it gives you the ridership and it gives you some geographic expansion of the WETA service area. And so a few services to highlight that we think check those boxes, Berkeley to Larkspur. So this is a service that would have relatively promising ridership potential, but also represent a geographic expansion of the WETA service area. And then from moderate growth, we go to a much more aggressive and expansive vision of what WETA could be in 2050. So this is the high growth network expansion concept. So 21 terminals, 29 routes. So looking quite different than what we operate today with the 10 terminals and 6 routes. And this would take a lot of some of the terminals that were included in the moderate growth scenario as local services, and it would propose to actually operate regional services out of those terminals. So these are, not necessarily services that today, based on our understanding, would have a relatively high ridership potential, but would offer other compelling, kind of check boxes of other interests, such as economic development, such as creating new linkages between activity centers that don't currently exist today, either by driving or transit. So there would be other compelling reasons beyond just the number of people that, the number of butts you put on the boat, I'll say. And then, this, obviously would be a significant expansion of WETA's geographic reach. And it represents a high growth scenario.
Quick question here. So we're talking about the expansions in regards to terminals and routes. What about, are we saying anything about assumptions in regards of service or frequency of service under each of these scenarios?
Yeah, so for each of these 3 scenarios, we're ultimately going to, and there'll be some subsequent slides that describe this, we're going to evaluate them against a range of futures that reflect some uncertainties in terms of internal things that we can control internally, how we operate these services, and then some external factors, how the region grows, what the region's transit policy is like. And so that would be the opportunity where we begin to play with variables like, well, how would this perform as a peak only service? How would it perform as an all day service? What if there was more of a focus on weekends and special events? How would it perform there? And so I guess a way to think about these as network expansion concepts, think about them as the terminals and routes
Yeah.
that you propose for the vision, and then how that service is operated really becomes a factor that we look at as part of the future.
Perfect, thank you.
This gives kind of a summary of, in addition to the current network, the three options, again, that we're proposing to carry forward in the study that we would do over the next few months. So baseline, moderate growth, and high growth. And maybe I'll take a quick pause to see if there are any questions, comments, clarifications that we can offer on the network expansion concepts.
There's a new development going in San Francisco. I think it's Pier 50. So that would be in between Hunters Point and Mission Bay. I think it's Pier 50. I might have the number wrong, but it's the old power station that I think PG&E operated. And so they have funding for water transit, a few $1 million. And I know we've been talking to them about working with them on that project, but it doesn't show on the map as a potential location for San Francisco.
Yeah, if I could take that, but there are a number of places on that southeast shoreline that have potential for water transit, and to your point earlier, there is quite a bit of development happening there. Finally,
Pier 70, Pier 50.
So that is, there are places in between Mission Bay and Hunters Point that might be worth us looking at for service. And as you say, there are some funds attached to that particular development. So we're not just deciding that we're going to leapfrog all of those here. There may be points in between those two dots that we serve as a part of this high growth scenario.
So I guess I'd like to, since we're doing this exercise and, we're trying to, I think, be inclusive, wouldn't it make sense to include stuff that would make sense? I mean, there may be reasons why it's, things don't, we're missing, Emeryville, which is a really close shot to a bunch of places, right? From Oakland to Berkeley to San Francisco. I don't know whether Emeryville, there's a marina over there. I don't know whether there's a possibility of a terminal. It certainly seems to me to make a lot of sense to go to Emeryville if you could go there. But, have we looked at that to see, what does the world of the possible look like as opposed to, something less than? Because once you don't include it in a long-term plan, think it makes it a little bit harder to say, well, we're looking at this and we're developing a business plan, but it's not even included in the long-term vision. Another question I would have is, the world seems to stop going southward at Redwood City. I know there's a lot of barriers to go farther south than that, but that's a big stretch of bay to the south that includes the Silicon Valley place, which has a lot of jobs and a very poor jobs housing balance. So, and there's a lot of shoreline activity in Silicon Valley. So is it infeasible? Have we determined that it's infeasible to go to Silicon Valley? So those are
Our South Bay expert podium here.
I yield to the other side.
I think you're making a really good point, Chairwoman. There was also discussion about San Mateo Bridge and Carquinez Bridge as examples. And this, of course, isn't fixed. This is for, just planning purposes today. But I think before this is finalized, I think there needs to be a little bit more discussion. And you're right in regards to Silicon Valley, whether it's hovercraft or some other technology that becomes more feasible as a green option in the future that is possible. And by 2050, certainly. So I agree that I don't think we should think of this as final now. I think it needs a bunch of tweaks depending on some of the feedback received from stakeholders and both from an emergency response perspective that we talked about in the San Mateo Bridge and Carquinez, but having terminals or opportunities to implement service in these corridors in an event of an earthquake or something else, might be necessary in potentially both the moderate growth and the high growth scenarios.
I was at the opening of the newest Gilead facility in Foster City a few weeks ago, in which, they've invested $1 billion, which is pretty good. So we're seeing some companies, despite there's some flight out of the Bay Area, we've got a huge biotech development process going on in the Bay Area in a lot of different places. So people are investing, and those are pretty sticky investments. Once they go in, they don't go in lightly because they're very costly. So West Berkeley, Bayer, and Gilead and Foster City, and there's North Bay, there's a lot of San Francisco, there's a lot going on, as Director Moyer could tell you. And, but, there's no mention of it. And so they're engaged in discussions. I talked to the mayor, I talked to a bunch of folks at the opening, and they're very much engaged in discussions around hovercraft and, and stuff. And, we did the study on hovercraft, and I don't know where we come out on it, but it just seems like from a planning perspective, it would be good to look at these potential locations and what it would take, and how we would maybe be involved. And, my view is the public agency was created to, not necessarily operate everything. I don't necessarily think we need to be the operator of every service, but we could be a contributor to that. And, if a lot of different services pop up in this new age because of new technology of, that we're seeing tested out, and we're not part of it, then what we could end up with is sort of a mishmash of stuff that's out there that's not interconnected. And so we have the potential to be the glue of this new water transit fabric. So I would urge, as we're looking at this, for us to be more involved in analyzing the potential, look at, there's only so many places on the Bay where you actually could potentially do something. And so let's be inclusive about it.
So if I may just, I think that's an excellent point. And all of the locations you mentioned are extraordinarily shallow, including the one in San Francisco, which comes back to the agility we were talking about in our committee meeting. And then again today, of just as we work through some of these considerations and guideposts for the plan, then how does that inform to Director Wonderman's point, what type of vessels are we seeking for the future? Because we're going to do that expansion. I don't know enough about Hercules and Martinez and Benicia, but I suspect there's some depth issues there, where we have an item on the agenda today where there's depth issues. The silt is getting more and more challenging in the Bay. So I'd love to see how that parlays, while we're continuing to build on the plan and maybe run parallel on what's the future of our vessels.
Hey, Jim, can I jump in for a minute?
You can. You have the honor of being a director. You're powerful.
So I agree with the South Bay. I think I've been on that page for, I don't know, since I've been on the board. They used to run ferries down there, and that we talk a lot about that. So I agree with everybody on that. And I know there's issues down there. But I'd like to just comment on two other things. One of those being Martinez, Benicia, Antioch, Pittsburgh, that area. If we're talking about future growth, growing the service out in that way. If you look at the developments that are going out in the San Joaquin Valley and out in that area, they're humongous. And a lot of those people are commuting into the Bay Area, and that commute out there has been a disaster for a long time. And I still believe, and I know, that last mile and all that stuff you talk about, but if you can get people out of their cars and on a boat to come into their job, I think that is a way of the future that people really would take advantage of. So again, I like the way it looks out there, with potential and, just planning this out, but, how do we get out there and how do we make those routes successful? I mean, again, we talk about small boats. I'm sure that's going to come up later in the conversation, but getting to those areas and how do we get there and how does it become sustainable financially? I just really want to put a lot of emphasis on that East Bay area where, it doesn't have the smart trains, Caltrain. It's got BART, and that's basically it. That goes out to Antioch, and I think there's a lot of potential out there to grow the ferry service. And then the second thing that I'd like to bring up is Larkspur over there. That one of the biggest complaints I get is how come you have to go to the ferry terminal to transfer. We can't have direct routes from the East Bay and all these places directly to Marin County. And I know we have another partner over there that runs a separate ferry service, but I think there should be a lot more focus on how we can partner with Golden Gate so we can do these interconnected routes. So that would be my comments on this part of the discussion. And thanks. I appreciate the detailed work that went into it.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think you make a really good point. And I think when we talk about economic development, those areas on the map are areas of the Bay Area that are most in need of new activities. A lot of them are old waterfront, heavy industrial manufacturing plants that are shuttered. And there is development happening, and the cities are being industrious and maybe attractive to funding that could include water transit service. And I think I've said this before, and it's sort of responsive to Director Intintili's comment, is that as we've seen in development occur around the Bay or potential, we shouldn't be the last to be involved in the development deal when there's a transportation mitigation that gets paid, and after the conversation, they reach out to the bank of WETA and say, well, what about the ferry terminal?
Right.
We should be in that conversation from the very, very beginning. Also, Martinez is the location of one of the busiest transit Amtrak stations, Capital Corridor line, San Joaquin's line in the country, and it's physically very, very close to where a ferry terminal could be. So that's it's really a potential way to get people, a different way to get people into the Bay Area from the Central Valley that would also and from Solano County and Sacramento, that would be potentially very good for increasing our labor market, create a new potential for people to get there. And finally, I live near Martinez, and there should be some perk to this job. Right now, there's not. So a terminal there would be good, I think, for other reasons.
I think Kevin was going to explain some of the concepts around why we have these lines on the map and not some of these others, which is is overarching to this discussion. And then I do want to just be conscious of time.
Yeah.
We're going to run out of time for public comment.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Right.
Well, just a couple of things just to maybe address some of the questions that have come up. I mean, I think it's instructive, and we've run this discussion a couple of times in trial. And when you show a map, people tend to gravitate towards the points on the map and where's my house. It's instructive to look at this map not as a hyper-realism representation, like a Chuck Close painting, but more like Picasso's Blue Period. It's representational, abstract in a sense, because just for example, Berkeley, Emeryville, Albany. We've done a couple of site selection analyses in the past, and that's really one market. That's the Bayshore Freeway market. People tend to live in a place like Emeryville or Kentfield or whatever, and they tend to go to one of those places. In the past, we've gravitated towards Berkeley as the best location to serve that market because of its central location. It's possible in the future that market is so explosive that we need more than one location, and Albany and Emeryville are part of it. But part of this analysis is to not choose a future, is to not say, well, we're going to bet on Emeryville or we're going to bet on Berkeley, but we're looking at a market expansively. In terms of the South Bay, and we're going to get into it, Mike's about to talk about it, but there's transportation investments. We potentially are going to see a high-speed rail service that gets you to San Jose in 25 minutes or something ridiculously, really good. And if that comes to pass, then that's really going to be the best option for anyone to go to the South Bay. But that may not come to pass. But the point is, in terms of our effort here, we don't have to choose one or the other. We just have to be able to look at a number of different futures and see how we can perform. So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of, I think it's natural for us to pick out points on the map, but we're really looking at markets. And then the analysis really looks at markets on a regional and sub-regional basis.
I would just respond to say, if I'm the mayor of Foster City and I look at this, I say, what about me? And, your point is really well taken.
Yeah.
I think it's well taken, although if you start looking at maybe smaller vessels and different kinds of crafts and more localized kinds of services, which is one of the considerations, then, maybe Emeryville to Berkeley is an interesting idea for different kinds of, opportunities that could exist. I don't know whether it is or it isn't, right? It's an example, but I think we're headed in the right direction in a lot of the ways that we're thinking. And I'm just suggesting, for the purpose of analysis, we be a little bit more aggressive. It's not to say, and maybe there's a way to show it on the map, the way you express it is that, you've got your sort of what we see as a core market, and then we see locations where there's, the
Potential. Yeah, I like that idea, that it's a little bit more fluid and then seeing all of these lines and thinking that nothing outside of these lines would be possible in the high growth scenario. And I understand this is only for planning purposes and very for guidance, but making it clear through text or through visual that these are a number of options. We would land around 20 terminals and 30 routes or something like that. But having a few additional points on the map might be a good idea. And especially with some of the locations where funding has been secured towards Ferry, just acknowledging that as well would be good.
I concur with Jim and Jessica also.
That's helpful. Yeah. Thank you. We're going to try to get to public comment quickly because
Oh, we have so many more slides. Let's get.
All right.
So let's have that.
So we will incorporate the feedback that we heard today. It'll add a few things here. It may add some money and time to the budget, but we can absorb that. And that'll be, those revised slides will be what we carry forward over the next few months to do the evaluation on. So to the evaluation, this is, we're going to, I want to thank the subcommittee for really, challenging us and giving us some great advice to really adopt a really cutting edge approach to how do you study these things. Traditionally, we would take these three options, run them through a black box, determine cost, determine benefits on one given future, one set of assumptions, and then you pick one and you go with it. I think we all understand the uncertainty that we have, that we're facing in the future regarding population, regarding work patterns, WETA fares. What does the region actually build in terms of transportation? What are our policies? What are our priorities? Climate change. Where does how much development happens along the shoreline? How much doesn't? So it's it really is an unprecedented level of uncertainty. And so we've designed, again, with the help of our subcommittee, an approach that, I think will really facilitate the best decision-making possible in terms of which of these network expansion concepts we coalesce around, by really looking, in the scenario planning process. I kind of developed, walked through these 3 points here. What this looks like visually is kind of like this matrix. And so on the vertical axis, network expansion concepts, you see the 3 network expansion concepts that we've proposed here, and they'll have the revisions that we discussed. On the horizontal axis, rather than just have that one future that you would have in a traditional approach, we're actually going to test these options against 4 futures. And this, will give us some insight into if things went a range of ways going forward, which option is the most resilient? Which one performs the best against, the widest range of uncertainty that we could face? And so in terms of defining these futures, again, this was, built on the foundation of the feedback we received from the stakeholders. Ultimately, we're going to have 4 futures, and each of them are going to live in a quadrant of this plus sign here. And in terms of what differentiates these futures at a very high level, we have two kind of key variables here: transit policy and travel behavior. And I'm going to walk through what each of these mean for the futures that we've defined. So let's begin with full steam ahead. So in terms of travel behavior, the two ends of the spectrum on travel behavior are: do we return back to the way people used to work before the pandemic, or is this new way that people are working now, does that carry forward into the future? And so, would the changes that we've seen be lasting, or would we revert back to pre-pandemic expectations? And then in terms of transit policy, the two ends of the spectrums are really, do we design our services and provide our services in the way that we did before the pandemic, with an overwhelming focus on peak period, AM, PM, rush hour service, or do we continue doing something that we've experimented with in the pandemic recovery program over the last year, where we take that service level and spread it more evenly throughout the day? So full steam ahead. Full steam ahead says everything goes back to the way it was. And this might not be likely, but it's a possibility. And again, represents the range of uncertainty that we face. So full steam ahead is we're doing peak period service like we did in 2019, and people are coming in the office 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, just like they used to. And we really go back to offering the services from a fair, from a service design standpoint, the way that we used to in 2019, full steam ahead. Throttle back. So what if these changes are lasting and we were, for whatever reason, from a transit policy standpoint, to go back to providing the services the way that we did? So peak period only services, but in an environment where there's significantly less travel demand, where instead of going in the office 5 days a week, people are going into the office 2 or 3 days a week. And so this scenario, we would likely throttle back what we offer because there's fundamentally less demand for that service. So again, the context here is we're not picking one of these futures. We're not saying one of these is going to happen. We're testing each of the 3 concepts that we've developed to see which one is the most resilient for a range of uncertainty. Going to the next one, what if everything changes? And this is the tack to the wind future. So the change in travel behavior that we've seen is permanent, and we really we stick to this notion of providing our services more evenly throughout the day. This would be a really fundamental change in the way that we've offered our services. And this is probably the most consistent option with what we've done in the pandemic recovery program, which was kind of this year-long experiment that we've now extended into a second year, to respond to, fundamental changes in our operating environment. And then, just to round out the discussion here, the 4th future, chart a new course. And so this is, less of a change fundamentally than tack to the wind. So demand goes back to pre-pandemic conditions, 5 days a week, but we continue with this service design that spreads the services we operate more evenly throughout the day. So kind of pandemic recovery program service design with pre-pandemic demand. So rather than a wholesale change in the way we do things, this is chart a new course. So a little turn of the wheel rather than a tack into the wind. And I'd like to actually give our consultant credit for the terms that came up here. They have a great nautical theme. So Fair and Piers, our transportation consultant, helped us develop these. Hopefully they're intuitive and make sense. But I'll leave that for discussion. So this takes that matrix that we showed before, and populates the futures here with the scenarios that I walked through. Again, this is the basis of the evaluation and analysis that we're looking for your input on before we go forward with in the next few months. It will be evaluating these concepts in the future environments against a whole range of criteria. So it's not just cost, it's not just ridership, but we're going to be really leaning on the focus areas that we defined in the early part of this project and looking at how well these concepts and the routes within them perform from an emergency response standpoint, how well they perform environmentally as consistent with the environmental stewardship focus area, community connections, what kind of connections between the activity centers these terminals seek to serve and the terminals exist or could exist. Equity, which is the other component of community connections. And then obviously there'll be, as I said, we look at cost. So that's really the financial capacity part of it. So I'm going to pause. That's a lot. Again, it's a relatively new approach to future planning that only a few agencies that our team's aware of in the Bay Area, namely the Caltrain and MTC through their Plan Bay Area Horizon work, have kind of done. And happy to answer any questions or comments you have about the approach.
Seems highly appropriate to me to go about it that way.
I really appreciate it. I find there is so much uncertainty ahead of us. And right now, this exercise would be pointless unless we took uncertainty for granted into the planning process. So these futures make perfect sense for me, that we're mixing the transit policy and the transit behavior into our growth scenarios. And like you said, it gives us an opportunity to explore specific strategies and scenarios that will perform the best independent of the future we're in 20 or 30 years from now. So I couldn't be happier. Yeah.
That said, we're paying the consultants a lot, so they should be able to predict the future. I know this, it probably wasn't in the contract.
And again, I would also give a big kudos to the Fair Pierce team for coming up with the concepts and the future concepts and the naming. They're extremely fitting, and I think it makes it having our three scenarios, but explored in different futures, is something that's easy to understand, although it's an incredibly complex way of planning for the future. But it's the only way forward. So I appreciate it.
Yeah. So just let me point out, because time is not our friend, we can go beyond noon in the meeting to take public comment. So that doesn't mean we should shorten our comments more, but go ahead.
Okay, so speaking of paying a lot of consultants a lot of money to predict the future, we also have another group of consultants and Nancy Whelan partners that have helped us outline our financial capacity moving forward in time over a series of scenarios. This is a work in progress, and you're about to see part of it's half complete. We're going to get the other half in the fall. And the key question on the left-hand side is, what is precisely what Director Antantilli has been raising? What is our ability to pay for our future operations under a various group of scenarios? In terms of data sources, this is a conservative analysis. We're not assuming future revenues, future sources that are speculative. This is assuming today's known sources, not RM3, but RM2, federal sources, and I'll get to those. On the left-hand side are our known revenue sources for operations. This is looking at exclusively operations, not capital, in terms of not what we need to build a Redwood City or a Foster City, but how do we operate the system? We have yet to look at repair and replacement for an expanded network. of new vessels and how we maintain those vessels. This is really just looking at operating the system. On the left-hand side are the two scenarios that we have done. Existing means we take the existing system, our existing service level now, we operate that through 2050. What is our ability to pay for that? We don't change, we don't expand, we just run our current service essentially forever. The Planned Bay Area baseline is something we've already defined. It includes an enhancement in terms of service, increases in frequency as the market grows, as well as those 4 expansion projects that are currently in development: Treasure Island, Mission Bay, Berkeley, and Redwood City. On the right side is the work to come. That moderate growth scenario with lines on the map, and the high growth with even more lines on the map. This is a graphic representation of the Planned Bay Area. Again, our existing network, what we do today, with some additions on the San Francisco waterfront, as well as Mission Bay, Redwood City, Treasure Island, Berkeley. What also is happening here is we're enhancing actual service levels. So you're seeing 15-minute frequencies and 30-minute frequencies as time goes on. A note about RM3. So we assume in all of our future scenarios that RM3 is available and it shows up in fiscal year 25. If it does not, and we do not have RM3, then we face an $11 million deficit in fiscal year 25. So we don't really last more than 2 more fiscal years without RM3.
Even for existing service.
Existing service. So our runway is essentially 2 years without RM3. If we were to add that up over time, that's $653 million of cumulative deficit. So moving on to with RM3, again, I'll just walk through the 2 on the 2 columns. The existing network, again, that is running our existing service. No change in how we do that service. We get to 2045. That includes RM3. RM3 shows up in fiscal year 25.
Or operating.
That's just operating.
Oh.
That's just operating.
No, we're in a turn.
So we make it almost to the end of the 2050 period. We make it for another.
That's not without. So does that include diverting capital money in RM3 to operating, or?
There's no, no, it does. It's just the operating.
Just the operating.
Just the operating.
Got it.
The Planned Bay Area baseline, again, with that level of enhancement to the existing service, as well as some expansion, we rake it about 10 more years from today. So 2034, we run out of money. So in other words, even with RM3, doing our strategic plan, Planned Bay Area expansion, we do not have enough money to operate. Going back to the previous conversation of
$1 billion shortfall with RM3 to 2050. That is
right. So we would need to identify $1 billion to operate that, to operate to 2050.
For existing service.
That's for RM3. That's for the Planned Bay Area service level, which is enhancing today, as well as some expansion. So yet to come with this analysis are the moderate growth and the high growth. Obviously, those are going to be higher, and the runway is going to be shorter. And I'll say this, that even the runways we're showing here are likely shorter because we haven't done the capital replacement component of the analysis as well. So in other words, those new Redwood City vessels, they'll have their own capital repair and replacement needs. We haven't yet done that. So those years, 2045 and 2034, are likely to be shorter than what we're representing here.
We also know that over the next 10 years or 15 years, we will be electrifying quite a bit of our fleet. And we don't have good assumptions about how that impacts our operating costs yet.
That's correct.
So, and fuel consumption, maintenance, repairs, how that will impact. But is there any way that we will have more information over the next few months to start taking that into account? Or would that be something we would do a few years from now, updating the numbers in a few years?
Well, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I should have pointed that out originally. This assumes we operate the conventional diesel vessels that we currently operate. We don't make any radical change to technology. We are already moving towards a change to technology. No, in 3 months, we will not know more than we know now in terms of their operating expenses and their operating dynamics and maintenance. That doesn't mean we can't make assumptions. In other words, educated guesses. And I think that's where we're going to end up having to go here. This is the intent here is to be instructive and not to just blanketly say we have no money, or not to say we have plenty of money, but to sort of try to put it in terms of a construct. We have enough money to make it to this year under this scenario. We have enough money to make it to that year under another scenario. And it's to help in terms of the board discussion, this frames where we need to go in terms of identifying future revenue sources.
Just back on that, and thank you. That's a really good question. And, you know, that's going to take some pretty sophisticated, informed analysis, but we're going to need to do that. The billion, 62 million, that's a cumulative deficit, correct?
Correct.
That's not a 20, 50 year operating deficit. That's a cumulative deficit.
Correct.
I'd also like to say, like, this is great information too, but obviously, you know, since I've been on the board, we've done a lot of outreach with RM3, getting things passed, going after grants, going after federal money, you know, working with communities, hopefully to put, you know, money into the pot here. So to me, this is a baseline. Like, I can't wait to see what it looks like for moderate growth and high growth, because to me, once we see where we're at, then we can make a plan on, you know, how we want to get to where we want to be, and you know, not be limited all the time. But I understand, like, this is good and it shows us what we got to run as a baseline, but I can't wait to see what we need and what we need to go after to get to that high growth slide also.
Thank you.
I'll just close it out here and talk about where we're going next, which is estimating the operating revenue. Again, we need to do the capital investment and the repair and replacement. So there's quite a bit of work to do still. This is mid-stride in terms of this analysis. We thought it was complete enough to share with you and help frame the discussion, but this will be a lot of our work in the fall. And we, on behalf of the team, definitely want to appreciate the discussion, the level of discussion, your patience. We really appreciate it. It's been great so thus far, our input, and I know you want to get to the public as well.
Yep. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks very much. That's, I know we're approaching the lunch hour and I was about to lose my appetite, but you know, this is the conversation we need to have. So can we flash on the, yes, thanks everyone, team, for your presentations and all of the comments that were made by directors and all the conversations, very healthy and good. Could we flash on the folks who are in attendance so we could see hands raised for those who'd like to make a comment? Or, and I don't know, Melanie, if folks have called in. Okay, so she's not here, so we're good. So I see Alex Walker, can't see the full name.
Griffin.
Griffith.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, Chair Wonderman and members of the board. My name is Alex Walker Griffin, and I have the pleasure of serving as the Vice Mayor of Hercules. And on behalf of the city, we would like to thank you for all your hard work and this wonderful presentation. As many of you are aware, the city of Hercules is looking to develop a waterfront. And as many of you are also aware, Hercules is the gateway to the East Bay, and it's also an intersection for our region. Being where we are, a lot of commuters face a variety of issues. If you wanted to travel outside of a bus for public transportation in about any direction, it's about 9 miles. 9 miles to the Richmond BART, 9 miles to the Vallejo Ferry, leaving us in an awkward situation for people who largely commute to San Francisco who miss out on certain opportunities that other folks from around the Bay Area have, which is why we would like to invite you to come out to our site of the proposed ferry system and have you come on out and join us for a tour and get you excited about what we believe is going to be the future of Hercules. A lot of residents have been waiting for this for well over a decade, and we're excited to bring this to the community and just build that connection. I heard a couple of comments about the chair living in Martinez. Well, Mr. Chair, I understand some of your grievances there, having been a lifelong resident here in the city. I can tell you it's a little difficult getting around town. And at the same time, I just wanted to echo that if we get more cars off the road, this is just alleviating some of the burdens that a lot of people here in the area and who have to make that right-hand turn on Highway 4 and continue on to the North Bay can forget about and not have to worry about. And it just eases up some of the roads, congestions, and some of our emergency service vehicles. And to echo some of the comments about the Carquina Strait, as someone who's lived in this city since I was 6 years old, I would tell you that's kind of been on the back of my mind. But again, we want to extend that invitation to come on out to the city whenever you'd like so we can show you around town. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deeply appreciate that. And I think any city named Hercules should get anything it needs. You know, if you go as far as to name your city, that after that, you should be able to pretty much do anything. You could lift WETA up on your shoulders. Maybe that was Atlas.
We're trying, so we extend that invitation. So come on over, neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions from comments from folks who are listening? I don't, please use the hand raise feature if you have a comment. Yeah, I don't see any at this time. Call out if that's anyone would like to comment. Any other comments in the meantime from the board members? We've got a few minutes left till lunchtime.
Jim, I'd just like to add, like I said something at the end of the financial thing. I really feel like, we need to know that information and it's important, but I also feel like as a public transportation agency, watching what WETA has become and the excitement out there, like from Hercules and other communities and people, ridership, and what we've been able to sustain through the pandemic, I really feel like we're well positioned to not limit ourselves on just what we have today. We really need to look at options for future funding and where we get funding from so we can expand the service. Because I think we're probably better positioned than any other transportation agency in the Bay Area right now to have that backing and the political will and the support to do that. So I just want to keep that in mind as we move forward.
Yeah, look, I think that, it's a really good point. And as I read the packet and you see all of the machinations of different funding coming from different places, funding we got, we started talking about zero emission vessels before we had any funding, and we've got funding in effect for 3 vessels. That happened in a very short period of time. And we haven't gotten all the funding we could have gotten. And there's a lot more on the table coming out of the bill that just passed and other forms of federal and state funding, around green transportation. And the governor just announced this last week, he appointed former mayor of Los Angeles, Antonio Villaraigosa, to be a transportation czar. And I'm sure that, you can count the number of days before we'll have Antonio on a boat, just as we had the director of Caltrans on a boat recently. So, we're going to, that's why we hired Seamus, is because he's really good at getting money for stuff, as he proved in his last job. We're going to be, I think, pretty wily when it comes to, in the future, looking for different sources and looking on the different rocks that maybe we never looked at before. And I know I have a lot of ideas, and my ideas tend to be a little bit crazy, but I think that, this just lays out the necessity. It certainly doesn't dissuade in any way for me. Karen Buchanan has her hand up.
Hi, I'm a 26-year public transit employee for the Golden Gate Bridge Highway and Transportation District. And I worked for Al Zaradnik, the husband of your former general manager, Nina Rannells, back in 98 to 2000 in the planning department. So I followed closely the formation of WTA and its transformation into WETA. And I'm just so grateful to be part of this community advisory group. And I applaud all your efforts for future visioning of ferry service to expand it to as many underserved communities as possible. I am a homeowner in Point Richmond, and I like the idea of the local ferry service for the short hops up and down the East Shore and all over the bay. That's very much needed. And so keep up the good work. That's all I got to say. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that what's happened recently on the Richmond Bridge really indicates the pressure on that corridor that we might be able to relieve. There used to be service across the bay at that point, provided by the Klamath, which isn't going to provide any service except to me and my people who work for me. But thank you for that. Really appreciate it. Mr. Gordon Douglas.
Hi, directors. Thank you so much for the presentations and the opportunity to listen in. I was on the community advisory board as well as a board member of the organization Transport Oakland. I'm also associate professor of urban planning at San Jose State and ferry rider and lover. Thank you, guys. I just wanted to take the opportunity. I wasn't going to raise my hand, but since there's a little time here, I guess, just to emphasize, and this is not to take one iota away from all of the wonderful emphasis on system expansion, which I'm 100% behind, but simply to remind that, we have all this conversation going on about things like Link 21 and the need for greater kind of resiliency through redundancy across the bay with a second tube or whatever, all of which is so uncertain compared to this ferry service that we have and can expand and make better. And I would just hate to see that fundamental service of real, regular quality and frankly, vital from an emergency preparedness standpoint, service between Oakland and San Francisco. I mean, that's still the core of our transportation network. It's where so many BART lines come together. It's where everything we already have comes together and works. And being able to get a ferry from right there in Jack London Square by the train, by the BART over to San Francisco is a huge additional asset for all the folks who are going back and forth in both directions. So just wanted to raise that. We all know it, but wanted that to be part of the conversation here too. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Douglas. Mr. Terry Scott.
Thank you, Director. I'm a member of the advisory group in Benicia. I'm also a futurist working with major international companies and national companies on 20, 30, 40, 50-year plans out. I'm very grateful to be part of this group. I do see significant opportunities, and I look at this as probably most of the people on this group. That we are in, and I hate using sports analogies, but I think in this one it just popped up, is that we're kind of in this hockey game where we're all carrying the puck and we're all looking for a way to score. But at the end of the day, we have to pass the puck and we have to be able to skate to that puck. And I look at the opportunities of environmental impact. I look at the opportunities of population shifts and where the population is going. And I think it is our responsibility, and hopefully the responsibility of this group, to be able to look at how the future will be moving demographically, moving up the straits, moving in the Benicia, Martinez, Antioch areas, and looking at those opportunities to look at the new conditions of the workforce. And the new conditions of the workforce are becoming more and more remote, with people moving into remote areas such as the Straits where I'm at, and then commuting in once or twice a week into the city and providing opportunity to get them there in an affordable and an environmentally safe way. So thank you all. I applaud the group and I applaud that we're working 30 years out. And if there's anything that I will be able to help with, I am more than willing and able to help. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much. You know, I commend you and the members of the Community Advisory Committee and the Business Advisory Committee and the folks who took the time to take the survey. You know, I think it tells us quite a lot. You know, the fact that in the survey that 41% of the people who took the survey who were interested enough to go on the website and comment use the ferry a couple of times a year, which tells me, and only 8% were regular riders. So that says market opportunity. These are folks who would love to use it if they could. And then they said, well, what are the problems? And the problems were, you know, the ferry doesn't go where I want it to go. The ferry doesn't run frequently enough. It's not reliable enough, and those kinds of things. So, you know, to me, when it comes to, you know, I am those people, you know, I love the ferries, but overall, I'm a transit, you know, maverick kind of person. Grew up in New York City, subways. I could name where every bus line in the Bronx went. You know, I was really into transit and have been involved in it in the Bay Area, which has an insufficient transit system. Unfortunately, we've invested a lot, but we've also seen in the Bay Area over the years, not an increase in people moving, even though we've invested a lot of money. The mode shift hasn't occurred. And of course, after the pandemic, it shifted in the wrong direction. So to the comments about getting people out of their cars, we haven't succeeded in doing that yet, but we need to succeed in doing that. And you know, I think the mission here really is to conceive not just where the hockey puck is going, but maybe where we'd like it to go, which is usually somewhere in front of the net, because a lot of goals get scored when it gets in that area. And so I believe we should be, I said this before, and I'll just say it again, you know, we should be more involved as an organization in trying to position the Bay Area for having, you know, and the greater mega region. And we see where people are moving, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. And we have to be cognizant of all of this, but getting folks better positioned to have the opportunity to live near the waterfront. You know, I look at what the Giants are doing with their development, you know, right across McCovey Cove from the ballpark, 40% affordable units, 40%. They can do that because of the overall value that's created. And it's not just the people, it's the resiliency that gets created in that area that deals with sea level rise and other things. So also doesn't show on the map, but we've got a ferry terminal right across the way. But this is our, to me, this is our opportunity. And we as an organization shouldn't limit ourselves to, we should be relentlessly optimistic, as Director Delbano said, and opportunistic, the way I always feel. So, you know, I appreciate the comment. I think at this point, are there any other members of the public who have a question or a comment? If not, any directors, Director Alba?
Yeah, I also want to give my appreciation to Mr. Scott and to Chair Wonderman here. I think I'm thinking beyond WETA. I'm thinking about the region, right? And what we're doing here is, yes, it looks like a huge amount of money, but it's spread out over several decades. And it's not just about this organization's growth. It's about the people that could get out of their cars and enjoy being on the water in corridors where it makes sense, at times when it makes sense. And it's something that the region will benefit from. And I think that's what we're doing here with all of the stakeholder input that we're getting. And just like you said, Chair Wonderman, that so many people who responded to the survey are not even able to use the survey today or our service today. So I think we need to think beyond just WETA and think about the region. And hand as much information as possible to our partner agencies and MTC and ABAG, and that's really what this plan can do.
Right, thank you. Director Murphy, any comments?
Yeah,
before we
thank you.
close? Yeah.
Thank you. I do just want to thank our staff and the consultants for the work that they've done on this. This is sticker shock, and it's in some cases intentional. We need to be realistic about what implementing a service vision is going to take over time, and that's going to help us frame what we need to frame from an advocacy standpoint. It's going to help us develop strategies to help create these funding opportunities, and just to project where we're going from here a little bit. We haven't gotten to the point where we've fully identified all the costs. Obviously, we know there's some gaps that need to be filled there. We also haven't gotten to the point where we've identified how this service vision, if we choose one of these very optimistic, moderate, or high growth scenarios, how it will be phased in over time and how these different opportunities will be prioritized. Mm-hmm. And that gets to the criteria and the conditions that will need to be in place for us to decide, okay, it's time to focus on this expansion opportunity or that expansion opportunity. And we've always thought about capital programs, having some seed money that we control and using that to leverage state and federal sources, and in some cases, private sources. And I think what we're seeing here is that even on the operating side, we're going to need to start thinking about having our $35 million a year from RM3 and whatever we might get to help shrink that operating shortfall that we saw starts, in some cases in a couple of years. If we have RM3 in 2035, even using our baseline scenario, we need to think about those operating funds that we control and using those to leverage other operating funding from municipalities, developers, all of the things that you were talking about that Ron Cowan had in his vision. We've seen examples of it come up. The development in San Francisco that you pointed out that has Ferry funding tied to it, the capital investment that they made in Treasure Island and the toll revenue that's going to come with that to help operate that service. Those are things we need to start socializing now as strategies that communities can use to leverage and position themselves to really climb up the food chain in terms of priority when we start talking about phasing and expansion. That's one of my big takeaways from this, and I think one that we're going to need to just continue to make evident through the process.
I would just point out, we're in a region that's rich with rich companies. We have, I think, 37 Fortune 500 companies in the Bay Area today. And a lot of companies aren't in the Fortune 500 because they're still just have high valuations, but they're still private companies, but they're real. And a lot of those companies are looking for, two things. They're looking for connectivity for their employees. They're really concerned about their talent and being able to get their talent to and from wherever their talent needs to go, maybe 1 day a week or 3 days a week, but they're really there's a lot of planning that's going into this today that's a little different than a few years ago. And then they're also looking for ways to contribute to regional equity. It's high on their list. They're looking at ways to improve the environment, and their employees, want to be part of a company that's addressing the wealth gap in the region. And so, I believe a lot of these organizations would be really thrilled to contribute to something that both helps find solutions for their employees' movement and connectivity that's positive, and there's nothing more positive than connectivity on the water, and B, a way they can show that they're helping people who would have a problem affording to use that same system as their employees would have. So I think some of these companies are already in conversation, with us and with private operators about that. And I think we should avail ourselves of the opportunity that's out there with some of the folks who are part of the business advisory group and others who weren't. But it's out there. And I agree, you know, with what Director Alba said. It seems like it is a lot of money, but it's over a long period of time. And, you know, I think the leaders of the Bay Area, the elected folks, mayors, members of the legislature, they're really hot on ferries. It wasn't the case a few years ago. We're a little cooler to it, but that's really changed. Everything I can see is there's tremendous interest. Some of that was generated through the regional Measure 3 process. But there's a lot of positive views of this, what we're trying to do. And I think folks would be ready to be helpful if we can help them find the path. So I'm very bullish on the potential of this and also mindful of the challenge at the same time. Let's adjourn this part of the agenda and break for lunch. And we'll be back at 1 o'clock sharp.